Hello everyone, and welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering the Dretch. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. The Dretch shares page 57 of the Monster Manual with the Chasme, and its lore can be found within the Lesser Demon descriptions and lore, all found on page 53 of the Monster Manual. So, without further ado, let's begin there. Dretches are among the weakest of demons. Repulsive, self-loathing creatures, doomed to spend eternity in a state of perpetual discontent. Their low intelligence makes Dretches unsuitable for anything but the simplest tasks. However, what they lack in potential, they make up for in sheer malice. Dretches mill about in mobs, voicing their displeasure as an unsettling din of hoots, snarls, and grunts. And that's all there is when it comes to the lore of Dretches. As I have mentioned previously, kind of a recurring theme here with the lesser demons in that there isn't too much from the lore and description of the monster that we can use or pull from, but I think we can create something of interest here, and something that might be worthwhile for the players at your table. At the very least, it'll be fun. But before we go into the adventure crafting section, let's check out the Dretch's stat block, shall we? The Dretch is a small fiend, demon, with a chaotic evil alignment. It has an armor class of 11, which is natural armor. It has hit points that average 18, or 4d6 plus 4, and it has a movement speed of 20 feet. The Dretch has a strength of 11, a dexterity of 11, a constitution of 12, an intelligence of 5, a wisdom of 8, and a charisma of 3. Its damage resistances include cold, fire, and lightning. It is immune to the damage type of poison, and is immune to the poisoned condition. The Dretch has senses of dark vision for 60 feet, and a passive perception of 9. The languages the Dretch can speak are Abyssal and Telepathy for 60 feet, which works only with creatures that understand Abyssal. The Dretch is a challenge rating of 1/4. On to the actions. Multi-attack. The Dretch makes 2 attacks, one with its bite and one with its claws. Bite is a melee weapon attack with a +2 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 3 or 1d6 piercing damage. Claws. Also a melee weapon attack with a +2 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 5 or 2d4 slashing damage. And finally, Fetid Cloud, which can be done once per day. A 10-foot radius of disgusting green gas extends out from the Dretch. The gas spreads around corners, and its area is lightly obscured. It lasts for 1 minute, or until a strong wind disperses it. Any creature that starts its turn in that area must succeed on a DC 11 Constitution saving throw or be poisoned until the start of its next turn. While poisoned in this way, the target can take either an action or a bonus action on its turn, but not both, and cannot take reactions. And that's all there is when it comes to the Dretch. A fairly simple monster and clearly low level, designed for lower level adventurers or to be used in large packs, groups, in a sort of swarm fashion, if you would. But I think that there's enough there that we can develop an adventure or two implementing the Dretch as the spotlight monster for your adventure. So with the descriptions and stats out of the way, let's jump into some adventure crafting, shall we? Okay, so initially, the Dretch to me appears again to be a low-level monster, seemingly designed for low-level parties and early stage gameplay. So I'm going to start there. Right off the bat, the first thing I think of when I see Dretches is kind of like a sort of mutated giant rat. And I think that the use of a Dretch as kind of a pest or vermin is probably a good starting method for developing an adventure, especially an early adventure for low-level play. So something that I would think about doing or using the Dretch as would be in a sort of extermination style adventure where the adventurers perhaps make their way into a town or village or city, and there's a merchant, a shopkeep of some sort, and the shopkeep has been hearing some strange noises in their cellar, some odd hoots and hollers and growls and grumbles, and at first assumed that it was mice or rats sort of getting into their stock and taking things and all that kind of stuff. But in fact, it turns out to be these dretches, and your players have been requested to go down into the cellar and sort of clear stuff out for this merchant or shopkeep, right? And that could allow for a lot of advancement or progression of the campaign in that, you know, your players can make their way down into the cellar of the shop, and perhaps they've managed to discover that these creatures have maybe tunneled their way into the cellar of the merchant or shopkeep, and they sort of flee or escape once they're being challenged. You could create a combat scenario where perhaps the players arrive in the cellar, they sort of investigate, look around, they get ambushed by a number of dretches, like 3 or 4 of them, let's say, and after perhaps 1 or 2 of them fall to the hands of the party, the other 2 try to flee, and if the players are quick enough, they can track where the dretches have ran off to, and they notice a little sort of, imagine a mouse hole, if you would, in the wall or in the floorboard, just on a larger scale, right? So you'd need a bit more of a larger hole, perhaps one that's hidden by some crates that they scurry behind and disappear. And as your players approach to try to pull them out of there, they notice that there's this giant tunnel, and that could lead to your players perhaps traveling through that tunnel and seeing where the source of the dretches come from, and furthering the overall campaign, as well as giving you, the dungeon master, a bit more to work with and think about in terms of where they may be coming from, right? Or what might be the motivations or drives of these dretches. You could also drop hints, lay kind of sort of hints and nods and nudges to the fact that these are not simple creatures in the way of, perhaps a better word would be mundane creatures in the way of rats and mice, cockroaches, stuff like that. So perhaps this plagued shopkeep is not the only one. Perhaps the entirety of the town is being sort of accosted by these demonic vermin, if you would, that are going into their stores or going into their cellars or pantries or what have you, and are destroying everything. Perhaps it's more so that specific things are being destroyed. I think that could be very interesting, very cool, and a nice little clue to sort of drop to your players, where like these monsters that the townsfolk are not aware of, they're not quite sure what they are. You know, perhaps the few that have seen them maybe were like little kids or even regular folk that see them and just, you know, say, oh, it was a monster with bat-like ears, and it looked like its face was melting. It had jagged pin needle teeth and a snout like a pig, you know, but it stood upright and had the body of a gorilla or something like that. And it can lead your players to sort of wonder and contemplate what the monster is. But you could also present to them a hint in the way that maybe the dretches are only seeking out what would be considered holy items, if you would, right? So perhaps there's altars like of offerings or statues of gods or deities. Perhaps there's little medallions or talismans, trinkets and stuff like that. And those seem to be the only thing that the dretches are interested in. And those are the only things that are destroyed or removed or defaced or what have you, right? And you could present that in such a way where perhaps the final spot that the players go to is the shopkeep, who's also been suffering through all of these things. And as the players are trying to clear out these places, they realize once they make it to the shopkeep's place that the only things the shopkeep is missing or that are being destroyed and demolished are these holy relics of his, right? Or perhaps the shopkeep is an individual who deals in the trade of artifacts or, sort of rare items. And all of the rare items are left alone unless they have a sort of holy or godly connotation of some sort, right? You could even say that perhaps there's some sort of trinket that was also taken that was the opposite of that, something that was not necessarily holy, but something that was perhaps demonic, right? Perhaps there's an amulet to the demon lord Groomsh or something that the merchant has found, and that has gone missing along with all of the pendants and rosaries and censers and whatever of all of these other holy beings. So you can kind of throw your players for a bit of a loop until they encounter the Dretches themselves as this sort of lowest rung of the demonic monstrosities that they may be encountering in your campaign, right? I think that would be a good way to kick off the first couple of adventures, or the first adventure at all, and you can set that up quite easily, right? Like perhaps the shopkeep is the innkeeper. You could use the tried and true classic, you meet at a tavern and the barkeep requests your assistance in dealing with these vandals that seem to be breaking into the tavern and destroying the casks of ale and wine and stuff like that during downtime or when the place is closed. And also their family heirloom has gone missing, and the heirloom was a medallion to, who knows, Moradin, right? Or something to that effect. And that one adventure can kick off the whole campaign and sort of generate this through line of your players having to encounter and contend with and overcome these demons. Another way that you could use a dredge would be as a swarm of them, as multiple dredges, right? So for a quick recap on how challenge rating works, and it's sort of a guideline, it's not steadfast or firm or anything like that, but the way that it works is that if a creature like the Dretch, for example, is a 1/4 challenge rating, that basically means that one player at level 1 should be able to take on a Dretch by themselves, right? So 1 out of 4 means that you could potentially have 4 Dretches go up against a party of 4 level 1 characters, and all things considered and dice rolls permitting, should be a solid matchup, and the players should be able to overcome the enemies with some scratches and scrapes, but otherwise intact, right? So what you could do there then is basically just multiply that up to whatever the level is of your players, right? So if you have level 3 players, then you would have 3 Dretches per player, let's say, right? Now, when it scales up like that, or when you scale it up like that, I should say, it can become a little troublesome because of the action economy, and the Dretches will overall get more attacks in on the players. Therefore, the players will have a higher percentage or higher chance of taking hits, right? Just because there's 4 of them or 5 of them or 6 of them versus a dozen Dretches or 15 Dretches, right? So it's a bit of a balancing act. And if you want to implement more or less of them, as a little trick is you can always throw in more Dretches if you want to do like a swarm of them coming out of that mouse hole I described earlier. Just have them sort of swarming in and constantly attacking and making trouble for the party. And the party can continue to have to take them on until the battle is over or concluded. Or if you use a number that's too large, or the dice are just not in the favor of your players, after a couple of rounds and stuff like that, and the players defeating a few of them, a number of them, maybe half or something like that, perhaps the Dretches become demoralized and frightened and they try to flee, right? Now that's if you want to go the route of sort of a more balanced design of combat, right? Now you could make something that is very deadly using Dretches. You could make something very deadly using any monster really, and see how your players contend with it. See if they're willing to fight to the death, or if they are more eager to use the he who lives to run away lives to run another day principle. And you could play it that way. But a lot of the times I find that players will want to continue the fight because they want to win, which is understandable. That is part of the game that we're playing, right? It's an integral function, is the combat situations, them overcoming the enemies and gaining XP and trinkets and shiny things and gold and rapport or reputation, stuff like that. So I can understand why players would be less inclined to flee from a combat. I know in the few times that I was a player, I never wanted to run away. I always wanted to take a breather maybe and then come back to it with a different thought. But most of the time it was a desire to overcome the challenge and force myself to think more creatively and differently about how I could approach things, because obviously kicking the door down and crushing skulls wasn't working for me, right? But anyway, back to the point. Yes, you can use dretches for sure as a swarm tactic or as a swarm monster that just sort of endlessly come in and cause trouble for the players. I mean, I could see something to the effect of an evil sorcerer or necromancer, using multiple dretches, or an evil druid of some sort. Perhaps if you wanted to go something more tribal and, sort of chiefdoms rather than kingdoms, and highly articulate and well-learned individuals casting magic and stuff. You wanted to have a bit more of a low-tech, if you would, environment. You could use a tribal village that has a shaman or a druid, and they're capable of summoning the monsters of the forest, what have you, and it's these dretches, right? And then you have something that's like this endless wave or endless horde of monsters coming up to and challenging the players and attacking them and trying to kill them. And the players have to sort of cut through the swaths and swaths of dretches in order to get to the caster who is summoning them and ultimately finish them off, and perhaps collect their staff that allows them to summon these dretches, or perhaps a medallion or a gemstone that allows the individual to speak abyssal and therefore sort of confuse and convince the dretches to serve for them, right? Since these dretches are not particularly intelligent or anything like that. So, and then your players will have the ability to summon dretches, which could also lead to some interesting outcomes where perhaps the players will use it when they're in a pinch or something like that, but then they have to roll. You could have them roll a wisdom roll, or even have them roll an arcana or religion check type thing and set the DC to whatever it is based on perhaps how many dretches they're trying to summon or anything like that, and then that'll determine whether or not the player can actually control the dretch and sort of dictate its actions, or if they just summon the dretch and the dretch is now another problem that they have to deal with, right? So I think that could lead to some interesting outcomes as well. Finally, I think that the dretch could be used as a form of spectacle or sideshow or something like that. Perhaps there's a traveling performance thing, like a traveling circus of some sort, or, maybe some sort of oddity cart or convoy of people that are there to show sort of freaks and geeks, and a sideshow, a carnival of sorts that has come into town. And wherever that carnival goes, for some reason, there's always people that go missing. There's always people that get hurt. There's always people that are injured or killed. It sort of leaves this dark cloud in its wake as it travels from town to town. And perhaps your players are at a town where this carnival, this sort of dark ages, medieval fantasy, Ripley's Believe It or Not, has established itself, and the players have to go in and take a look and see what's going on. And, perhaps the dretch escapes from its cage at night. Perhaps the dretch escapes every night and returns to the cage. Perhaps there are multiple dretches, and this caravan, as it were, is sort of dropping off dretches at every town and city, right? And perhaps the reason is that, again, it could be an item, or it could be a sorcerer or summoner of some sort that is summoning these dretches, presents them as this strange, monstrous, grotesque creature for people to look at and pay coin to see, throw popcorn at it or whatever it is. And the dretch will invariably escape. And so when the Dretch escapes, the caravan leaves, and the individual summons another Dretch to take its place, because what do they care, right? They're in it for the coin. And I think that that could lead to a pretty interesting series of adventures, even like a nice leg of a campaign, as you have this sort of carnival of chaos that goes into towns and sort of causes trouble for all of the citizens of the town, right? And you can always ramp things up. You can always present larger monsters and sort of demons or any form of creature really that is within this sideshow, right? And it can turn out that the main problem or the main villain of all of this is the ringmaster itself, as it were. Perhaps the ringmaster is a greater demon or a demon lord in disguise, or some sort of trickster being that's sort of there to just sow chaos, and your players have to try and contend with them, right? And I think that that could lead to a nice chunk of adventure time for your players at the table. All in all, though, I think the Dretch is an interesting monster and pretty cool looking. There's not too much to work with. However, I do like its ability, or its final action rather, of the fetid cloud that makes everything sort of obscured and difficult to see, and can poison people if they fail their constitution checks, and then they're sort of limited in that way. So maybe hold off on using a large swarm of them that constantly cast it, because then it's pretty likely that your players, especially at a low level really, but it's likely that your players will be in trouble if they're poisoned, because they can only take an action or a bonus action, and can't take reactions. That's another way that you could actually use the Dretch in a very cool way, is sort of have this perpetual hinting of the presence of the Dretch by there being like this sort of noxious cloud that stinks wherever they go. It smells terrible. They constantly have to roll these constitution checks, or constitution saving throws actually, and then they're poisoned until the start of their next turn. And I think that that could be an interesting way of even having the players sort of venture forth through some dark and nefarious areas, right? If you were to use that tunnel system again, as I mentioned, where the tunnels from the shopkeep's place lead to perhaps the fishmonger's place, lead to perhaps the guard's armory, or perhaps to under the church or the chapel, and as the players travel throughout it, they kind of have to put a rag to their face so they can breathe properly. Perhaps one of the town's, noonday masses was cut short because there was this expulsion of noxious gas and nobody knew where it was coming from or what happened. They assumed it was perhaps some sort of geochemical formation. There was just a bubble of methane that burst out from underground and, left the chapel sort of smelling like farts, as it were. But overall, I think that there's a lot that you can pull from the Dretch, and I think that you can make some interesting and different adventures, and you can make adventures that would seem rather banal or typical, I suppose is the word, sort of have an interesting twist to them, where your players expect one thing and find out that it's something else, right? Perhaps the townsfolk blame the village of goblins down the road for breaking and entering and stealing all of their stuff and taking all of their holy relics because they're shiny, and they think that therefore these stupid goblins will take them and make whatever out of them, weapons or armor, or they'll try to sell them or give them as offerings to their tribe chief or what have you. But in fact, it's these mutated demonic vermin gorilla rats that are causing all of the trouble. But that's all I got for you guys when it comes to the Dretch and using them as a monster for your adventure or your campaign. On the next episode of Monsters Manifested, we'll be covering the Glabrezu. That's going to be fun to say a lot of times, and should be a pretty cool one to use. A bit of a higher level. Looks sort of like a demonic minotaur, if you would, but we will save that for the next episode. So thank you all very much for tuning in. I highly appreciate it. Please feel free to leave a review or a rating for the podcast, as it would help out very much. I would highly appreciate it. If you're listening to this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, I would kindly ask that you subscribe, like, comment, share, all of those fun things, as they would help the channel out, as they would help me out, help the podcast out, help get this podcast to more people's ears, perhaps give them some ideas for their adventures or for their campaigns. But either way, thank you all once again very much for tuning in, and I shall see you on the next episode. Have a good day, everyone.